Welcome to the No Limits Podcast. Today we are excited to be joined with you with TJ Newman. Welcome.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be on. Thank you for having me.
Yes, congrats. This episode will probably be airing sometime this week, so by the time you do this, you'll have had your third pub day. Congrats on the worst case scenario pub day.
Thank you. Yeah, as we're recording, it's tomorrow. Tomorrow, Tuesday the 13th, is pub, and I can't believe it. Like you said, third book. It's like, wow, here we are again.
Yeah, can you give us just a little bit more of a background? We just covered and read your first two books. Amazing, by the way. We're so excited that we could have you on before your third book. To just give us a little bit. We obviously know your background, but just anything you can tell us about this book. What led you down this path.
Yeah, sure. Well, my first book was Falling, my second book was Drowning, and my third book is Worst Case Scenario, and all three are aviation action thrillers. And the reason I went down that path in my literary career is I was a flight attendant. I was a flight attendant for 10 years. And when you do that job and you have a big imagination, the stories just come. And the idea for this book, my third book, Worst Case Scenario, actually came to me while I was doing research for my first book, Falling.
Yeah.
And when I was doing research for that, I was flying as a flight attendant still, and I would talk to pilots every day about, the nuts and bolts of being a pilot,
Sure.
policy, procedure, flying the aircraft. But I would also ask them questions about the psychological side, the emotional side of being a pilot. And the question that I would ask all of them was, what's your biggest fear? As a pilot, what's your biggest fear? And one day I got an answer from one of the pilots that just stopped me in my tracks. He looked me dead in the eye and he said, my biggest fear is a commercial airliner crashing into a nuclear power plant.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, exactly. And
that would never cross my mind at my first day, but
right. Me neither. And so I dismissed him like that. It was the furthest thing from my mind. I kind of dismissed him and I said, we live in a post 9/11 world. Like they've shown that that's not a valid fear. These structures are fortified. They've run tests and studies and this is just not, a reasonable thing to be afraid of. And he's listening to me sort of go through my reasons as to why I'm not afraid of this. And when I'm done, he looks at me and he says, and that's exactly what they want you to think.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, exactly. The hair on the back of your neck stands up and you're just like, okay, I don't know about that. And so when I was trying to figure out to write what I was going to write for my third book, I remembered that interaction. And so I just went to research thinking, was there any validity to that? Like, is there anything there? And it did not take me long into the research to discover that there is a lot there. And he was completely valid in his fears. And I got to tell you, the research for this book scared the hell out of me.
Oh, wow.
I mean, I almost didn't write it because I wasn't sure. I was so unnerved by what I was discovering that I wasn't sure I wanted to live in that world and in that possibility for the time that it would take me to write this book.
Yeah. Do you ever feel like, being in this aviation thriller genre, do you ever feel like you would scare people too much with your plots?
I don't think so. The premise, yes. I feel like I terrify them with the premise because the premise of all my books are
scary.
Pretty scary. Yeah, that's what they are. But I think if you read the books, the essence and theme in all of them, all three of them, they're standalone novels, but all three of them have a theme that runs through them, and that's ordinary people being put in an extraordinary circumstance. And I have a deep, deep belief that the everyday person is the hero that just hasn't had their opportunity to present that aspect of themselves. I firmly believe that ordinary people rise to meet the moment when they're put to the test. And that is what these books are ultimately about. So the premise is terrifying, but the actual story, they're actually really hopeful and really inspiring and really championing the best of humanity.
Yeah, no, I wanted to ask you about your your process of character development because I could definitely tell. Obviously, you said you spent 10 years as a flight attendant. You know, especially looking back at like Falling and the character of Joe, like you developed her, and she seemed like a real person. That whole crew seemed like a real people, and just like I guess coming through was, you've obviously maybe seen someone like that person, or it's an amalgamation of different people, and the same thing with the whole, the crew that was put in drowning in the plane when it drowned. You know, getting your experience from like different customers that you might have interacted with. So like, what goes into your like? How do you decide? Oh, I want to put this character in. What goes into that process?
Yeah, all of my characters are, no one's anyone specific, right? Everyone is just sort of like a mix of all sorts of people that I knew and that I flew with. It was really great after Falling came out. A lot of flight attendants read it, and it was wonderful to get the reaction of, I know Joe. Like, I've flown with a Joe. I
Gotcha.
know Big Daddy. I have flown with a Big Daddy. Like, there's such personality types that just sort of like are very common within the industry. So they're all snippets of everybody that I know and nobody in particular. Joe, I look at Joe, she's one of my favorite characters I've ever written. And I see a lot of my mom in Joe. My mom was a flight attendant. So was my sister. We call it the family business. I see a lot of my mom in Joe, sort of sweet as pie person who's just kind and courteous and wonderful, but will not hesitate to do what's necessary. Can
Right.
go mama bear in an instant. And I see a lot of my mom and Joe.
Awesome. So, speaking of this, your first two books, we know that they've both been optioned for movies. Can you give us any progress on that?
Yeah, extremely exciting. Falling is with Universal Pictures, and that's going well. I'm actually doing the adaptation for it. I'm writing the screenplay, which has been
Oh, wow.
yeah, exactly. Like a wild experience, a wild learning experience. It took me nearly 40 drafts to get that book where it needed to be a finished product. It took me years to write it. I thought I knew that story backwards. I thought I knew every way that you could tell it. And the adaptation process has been this like total rediscovery of how to tell a story. Because how do I take a story that, took 300 pages to tell, and how do I condense it down into 100 pages?
Mm.
And how do I go from a medium where we're inside the characters' heads and hearts and we know everything going on? How do I turn that into a solely visual medium? It's only what you can see. You have to get the same theme and vibe and feel and story and character across. It's been a remarkable education and journey doing that adaptation process. And I think it's made me a better novelist. It changed the way that I wrote worst case scenario. It when you go through that compression process of like compressing a story as tight as it can get, when you trim all the fat, it makes you have, at least it made me have like this relentless editor on my shoulder as I was writing, who was just constantly narrowing the focus to like, what is the story? What's happening in this scene? What are these characters actually discussing? And if you don't actually have a good answer for that, and a lot of the time you don't, there's a lot of fluff, a lot of fat in a novel. If you're writing the types of books I'm writing, which
Sure.
are plot focused, action things, how do you just laser focus it into the essentials? And that process of writing a screenplay really just changed the way that I look at story. So that's kind of the update with Falling, which is very exciting. Drowning is with Warner Brothers, and the sort of headlines there, which are really cool, are it's being directed by Academy Award nominated director Paul Greengrass, who people know from Captain Phillips, United 93, the Second Bourne movie.
Yep.
Which is just insane. And
That's so cool.
It's so cool. It's so cool. And the adaptation for that one is being handled by Steve Kloves, who has an incredible resume, but I think people know him most for adapting the Harry Potter books. He
Yeah.
did all but one of the movies. And knowing that, the writer who was tasked with adapting one of the most, globally beloved, set of books, which is an order that, I cannot imagine the pressure that you have adapting those stories, and hitting it out of the park, right?
Right.
Like the books and the movies are equally loved by the same fan base. Like, to be able to do that, I'm just in awe of what he did with that. And knowing that that man is adapting my story, it's just
You're in good hands. Yeah.
exactly. I feel like I'm in very good hands there.
Yeah. Well, that's cool. And I guess most authors don't get a chance to like go back and have a whole nother shot at, not like you want to change it, but like you're literally can do whatever you want now. Like, but that's got to be an uncommon experience for someone. It's cool that you get to do that.
You totally, that's such a funny thing. I never actually thought of it like that like you get another chance. Because I don't know about you, but like when I look at my work, like, I love all three of my books. They are finished stories. They are done. I'm happy with how all of them, but
I never want to look at them again.
and I don't, because like if I pick up any of my books and I've got a red pen in my hand, I will cover the pages. Like right now, I will cover the pages with red. And it's not that I don't love it for what it
Sure.
is right now, but it's like, I think as an artist, you're always doing that, right? As a writer, you're always looking at, oh, I would have used a different word, or I would have changed that scene, or I would have done that. So that is actually kind of cool. You do get to go back and get one more shot at it, which is, yeah, really, really cool.
So I guess, can you tell me a little bit more about like how you got Falling, made, like what took you down? Like, did you always know you wanted to be a writer?
Yeah, I am a lifelong reader, writer. I have dreamed about being a published author my whole life since I got, my first library card, and just read and hid in the bathroom reading my books as a kid. But my first love was theater, and that's what I pursued. I went to college for musical theater. I moved to New York after that, because that's what you do with a degree in musical theater. And since we're not talking about my next Broadway show, you can imagine how well that went. It
Gotcha.
was, yeah, exactly. Gotcha. It was just rejection after rejection. Just, I got nowhere. I got nowhere. And I finally, yeah, it's very tough. It's extremely tough. And nothing but kudos and respect to anybody who steps into the arena like that, because it's hard. It is hard. And after, a few years of that, I decided enough was enough, and I moved back home, Phoenix, Arizona, moved in with my parents, and then did the really fun, I'm in my mid-20s, sleeping in my twin bed in my childhood bedroom, wondering what I'm going to do with my life, which, again, so fun. Really just fun stuff right there. So in the middle of that, my mom suggested you should get a job at Changing Hands. And that's a local indie bookstore up the street that I'd gone to, my whole life. And, listen to your mother. They're right. I got a job there, and that time was so important. And I mean, this wouldn't happen without my time in the bookstore, because being surrounded by books and people that wanted to talk about books and people that love story and love that world every single day, like it changed me. It's when my dream of being a published writer turned into a concrete goal. And I'm grateful for my time at Changing Hands. But an opportunity came up via flight attendant. And like I said, my sister flew, my mom flew. It was an opportunity that I knew I couldn't pass up. So I left the store and I became a flight attendant. And that's where I had the idea for Falling. And so, I started writing that book. And when I finally felt like it was as good as I could get it, I wanted to see if I could get it published. And I guess you needed an agent. I found that out, after I started doing research, because again, I bootstrapped this whole thing. I had no idea. I didn't know anybody in the industry. I didn't know how to do anything. I didn't know what I needed. I literally bought a book called The Essential Guide to Getting Your Book Published. I read it and I followed the directions, and step one is get an agent. So I, started querying my work and submitting it to agents, and 41 in a row rejected it flatly. Which again, kind of like New York, so fun.
Oh yeah, I bet.
So fun. Yeah. And then my 42nd submission was my one and only yes.
Hey,
You only need one.
You only need one, and good job by him picking you up, because now you have 3 books. They're all amazing. I guess what specifically, like when you open your books, and I haven't, unfortunately we didn't get the arc for so I have not read Worst Case Scenario, but I noticed something from the first 2 where you opened it like kind of the same way, but you inversed it, where like in the first one we think it's going to be this attack, but it's actually a dream, and then you turn it around and do it in the second book, and it's actually real life, and this event is happening. So it's kind of you're tricking us in good ways. Is there anything we can look forward to in store for Worst Case Scenario?
Yeah, the beginning of Worst Case Scenario is probably, I think it's the most terrifying of all of them. I mean, it's not a spoiler. So the difference between this book and my first 2 books are the first 2 take place entirely on the aircraft. Like
Right.
they're, Falling is the entire book is just the life of one singular flight from LA to New York. Drowning is, the plane crashes just after takeoff, and then it's, a race against time for the very small handful of hours that they have before the air runs out inside the plane at the bottom of the ocean. This one, it's not a spoiler to say, because, by the end of the 5th page, the plane has crashed. So this one, whereas the first 2 take place entirely in that world, by the end of the 5th page, we're done with the plane.
We're done with the plane.
We're off
Okay.
the plane. And so this one takes place entirely on the ground in a small rural town in Minnesota. And it was a risk. I wasn't sure, one, for me as a writer, like, can I do this? If I leave, this world that I know and expand out, will I be able to do this? Can I pull this off? And then 2, it was a risk in that, my readers, will they want this? They know me as the flight attendant who writes aviation thrillers. If I
Right.
step outside of that, are they gonna follow me? And the reception has been really, really positive, and I'm really encouraged that the readers do enjoy it. So that's been encouraging. But the beginning of this one, I personally think is sort of the most terrifying and intense of all of them, just
Okay.
because there is no hope. You know what I mean? Like the other ones, it's like it's the inciting incident, and then we keep that world and move from there. This is just the inciting incident that's just like, and it's done. So this one, I think, is pretty intense, and it opens with, again, not a spoiler, it's the first sentence of the book. Pilot at 35,000 feet has a widowmaker heart attack and slumps over on the controls, dead. Like, that's stakes set.
Right.
And that's
right.
why I sort of do that in the beginning of all of them, especially with Falling, which was, yes, a dream sequence. It was important to me to set the stakes, right? To let the reader know how bad this could get, where this could go. And like most books, it doesn't start out that way. So it's like, just so you know, this is what we're headed towards. This is what it could look like.
Yeah, Mike had this funny thing where he's like, these books, they're like Armageddon, meets Apollo 13, meets Captain Phillips, meets like Flight United 93, Jaws, Die Hard, Lethal Weapon. You could just keep going. And for me, I immediately thought of like Die Hard, especially with Drowning, in terms of like this John McClane character with the dad. And I don't know. I guess that's why I really like these 2 books, because we typically cover spy thrillers on the show, but we're branching out. We're all thriller space, and it was just nice to read like these movies that they used to make, like good movies, now in novel form, and it's just like you said, they're these 300-page, but they're super intense, they're super quick. I imagine it's got to be hard to whittle that down to 100 pages. But yeah, Mike wanted me to bring that up. He also wanted me to ask you, and it's interesting that you said now you're branching out in this novel to being outside the plane. Have you seen the musical Come From Away, which is have you seen that?
I have not seen it. I
Okay.
know of it. Yes, I know
Okay.
of it, and I know it's wonderful. I know some of the music, but I have not seen it.
Yeah, so it's just for listeners, it's a musical about the small town where all these international flights had to divert on the day of 9/11, and they made a whole musical out of it. So I unfortunately have not seen it, but being someone who's in that like aviation thriller space he was wondering if you had seen that.
I have not seen it, but I really should. I just haven't. It's, that's what these books do, right? It's
Mm,
like you take like a massive incident and then you look at not just the people who are, and especially in this third book, it's sort of in that vein because it's like the plane crash is one thing, but then it's about, well, what happens after? What happens to the people that whose lives are impacted by this, not in the direct way, but who weren't on the plane. But these are the townspeople who,
right.
they're just sitting having their morning cup of coffee, and all of a sudden a plane falls from the sky. And to make even the parallel with September 11th, like I looked a lot at Shanksville, Pennsylvania,
Right.
at, United 93 that went down in Shanksville. Those people were just watching, those townspeople were just watching the news, seeing what was happening in New York and DC, and they were horrified. And then it happened to them. And what was that response like on the ground? And I looked at that quite a bit, when looking at what would happen in this case, because the plane goes down, a worst case scenario, in a rural town in Minnesota, Waketa, fictitious town, which by the way is a hat tip to Twister, Wakita.
Oh, nice.
We want to
You,
talk more about movies because every movie that you just listed is like, yes, that's my wheelhouse. That's what I love. I love those movies. That's what, I watched growing up. My bread and butter. I've seen them all a million times. And that's how I sort of see stories and how I see my books. They kind of play in my mind like a movie. And then I just sort of like transcribe them into a novel. So I appreciate that whole list. I love it.
good. Good. So you mentioned you working in this bookstore. When you were there, what were you reading? What are your favorite authors now? Or your biggest influences?
What was I reading then? That's a great question. Trying to remember what I was reading. I mean, I don't know what. I do remember when I was working there, because this was a while back, that the Hunger Games was coming out.
Okay.
And I remember that was also one of like the cool things, and one of the things that made me, want to be a writer, was just seeing that anticipation, that excitement. And like, I'm the person that went to like, the midnight releases of, the Harry Potter books and stuff. So then to see it sort of as an adult with the Hunger Games, and from the worker standpoint of the hype and all of that coming out, it was just, yeah, that was cool. What am I reading? I read a lot of thrillers. I read across the board. I've said this before, but Michael Crichton is like my creative North Star.
Mm.
He was the writer growing up that kind of impacted me as a storyteller probably the most, just seeing what you could do. I remember reading and watching Jurassic Park for the first time, and it just like opened my mind to possibilities. Like, we can bring dinosaurs back with us. Like, there's no limits. There's no limits. And it fundamentally changed me as a storyteller reading that book. But I also, I read a lot of nonfiction. I read a lot of literary fiction. I read all across the board. And I think that's, for me, I think that's really helpful as a writer. And you never know where, you're going to get inspiration from. One of the most, Writing Drowning, one of the most important books to that process was The Perfect Storm, which
Mm.
is a nonfiction book, that reads like fiction. And I realized, when I was writing that story, that it's like when you're telling a story about like a plane with people trapped inside at the bottom of the ocean, teetering on an undersea cliff, like the situation itself is so sensational that my writing couldn't go the same way, right? And so reading a nonfiction telling of a also the perfect storm, this larger than life incident, reading the way that he just pared it down to just basically like almost reporting it, it was a really important piece of inspiration for me to know like it needs to take on the tone like that. It needs to take on almost like you're just reporting this event as it's happening, because it's too big on its own. If you go big in your writing as well, it's just going to be it's too much. So I really try to have a wide palette of what I consume in my books and my movies, just because it all informs. As a writer, it all informs.
Yeah, like how do you take us behind like how you go about researching these novels? Like what for Drowning, did you do a lot of it seemed like you had me believe that you knew all about underwater welding. Like what was it like doing that kind of research?
I mean, the awesome thing as being a writer now is, we live in the information age.
Sure.
There's easily accessed information readily available, which is great. And then once you kind of figure out who to talk to, my brother-in-law is an engineer, and I start a lot of my research with him, just sort of like asking ideas and then going, okay, but like this, and he'll go through things with me and I'll be like, okay, but what specialist would I need to talk to? Like, who would know this? So he kind of points me in the direction, and then I can kind of go from there. Drowning was interesting in that, there wasn't a lot of case studies. There wasn't a lot of like, there's never been an incident like that I know of. So I sort of had to get creative with my research, but once I made the realization of like, it's a plane when it's flying. Once it's on the water, it's basically a boat. It's no longer a plane. It's basically a boat. And then once it sinks, it's essentially a submarine. Like the only way it's a plane still is if it's, just because it is an aircraft. But once it's underwater, that's a submarine. So then I could pivot. Once I reframed my brain like that, then I could research, okay, well, what do you do in the instance of a submarine in distress? What would that rescue mission look like? So once I reframed it for myself, then I could look at that and start researching from that angle. So the research, for worst case scenario was kind of easier from the standpoint of there was just more of it. Nuclear power is, it's a transparent industry. There's a tremendous amount of research out there, and people who have translated the research into something that, is easy for us non-nuclear engineers to understand. It was also something that, in researching Falling, I had experts every single day at work. I was the flight attendant who just asked questions constantly to the pilots that I flew with. So much so that like after the book came out, because nobody knew I was writing it, I didn't tell anybody I was writing it. I didn't tell them why I was asking all these questions. So when the book came out, I had so many pilots like contact me and be like, that's what you were doing? I just thought you were like really curious, or I thought you wanted to be a pilot. I thought you were considering, going, that direction. So I had those experts every single day. I had access to them. So yeah, it's just sort of like each project kind of takes its own form of what direction you need to go.
What was the hardest book to write? Or they've all been progressively getting harder or easier?
Great question. Falling, I had no idea what I was doing. I mean, I was just like, I had no idea what I was doing. I wrote that one as a pantser. It took me, like I said, nearly 40 drafts to get it there. It took years to do. Every single step of that entire process was a learning experience because I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know how to structure a story that big. I'd never written a story like that big. So I was clueless. So that one was hard because of that. Drowning was tough because it required a new kind of research that I hadn't had to do with Falling. And it also had the just overwhelming cloud of pressure that was over
Yeah,
it,
it's like a
right?
book syndrome. Yeah.
Oh my God. It was just this ever-present stress of, can I do it again? Was it a fluke? Am I a one-hit wonder? Do I have what it takes, or did I just get lucky? And fighting those external and internal demons was very stressful for writing that book. Very, very stressful. That's just not a great creative state, right? So yeah, so that one was hard because of that, I'd say. And also too, there when I wrote my first book, nobody even knew I was writing it, let alone waiting for it. So there was no time frame. There was, I could do whatever I wanted. This, when I was writing Drowning, it was like, oh, there's deadlines. People are waiting. There's an expectation. You have a contract now, so that was a whole new stress that I wasn't prepared for. This one, worst case scenario though, I think this one personally, emotionally, was the hardest to write. This one really put me through the ringer. It, I think the subject matter and just looking at mortality a little bit more intimately was tough. And these characters really got into my heart. I'm getting emotional. Really got into my heart, and it's the first book that I've written that and no spoilers at all, but it's the first book that I've written to that the ending, when all was said and done and everything that happened, there's some things where it had to be how it has to be, but I wish some things weren't how they were.
Right.
That's not a spoiler. That's not good or bad. I'm just saying, this one emotionally was the hardest to write. This one feels the most raw and personal to me.
Oh, wow. Yeah, well, because I'm no shame. Like during Drowning, I like to do audiobooks, but I'm driving in the car and Steven Weber is reading to me, and I'm like realizing I'm tearing up. I'm like, that's how much you got us invested in these characters in that storyline. So wow, if you're gonna take me to another level in this one, let's get ready. Yeah, you did a great job with that stuff.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I don't know if that says something about me as a person or as a writer, but like when people are like, oh, I cried, it broke my heart, I cried, I'm like, yes, gotta. Yes, make you feel that pain. If I'm gonna suffer, you're gonna suffer. Thank you. I went through so many boxes of Kleenex writing this book. It's crazy.
Oh wow. Well, I don't want to take up too much of your time, but before I let you go, we always like to ask who we have on, what are you currently watching, reading, or do you have anything you want to recommend to the listeners?
I mean, I've been watching the Olympics. Let's just be honest. That's all I've been watching right now because, the past couple of weeks I'm in withdrawals, closing ceremonies was last night. Again, the Olympics are nothing but stories. Like every single night, there's just somebody's got an incredible comeback story or, a failure, drama. Like that's why I love sports. That's why I watch so many sports is like, it's just this dramatic man versus man, man versus nature, man versus self. These stories are just epic. So that's all I've been watching the last 2 weeks is the Olympics. It's been on the TV just all day on mute, and then I'll come over and unmute it, if something's happening. Reading wise, I just finished a book again. I read all across the board. I just finished a book called The Guncle Abroad, which was just about as opposite of the stuff that I write as you can get. It's just this fun summer escape. It was, in a European holiday in Italy, family drama, and it made me laugh and it made me think. And it's again, how do you, I really think it's important to read all across the board because this type of stories that we write, they're not one shade, right? They're not one tone. Nobody wants to read an action thriller or a mystery suspense that's only that. There has to be, I think, an ebb and a flow. And so, how do you get inspired by other people in the way that they write and the genres that they write in, and bring it into your own work?
I'll have to check that one out. Well, thank you. Congrats. And everyone go get their copy of Worst Case Scenario.
Thank you so much for having me on. I appreciate it.